when we talk about accommodations, not every student with learning disabilities gets accommodations, but what are the kinds of accommodations that many students are likely to get on the SAT and ACT?
Yeah, so the most common accommodation that students apply for and receive is extended time. So this comes in a variety of fashions. The most common is to get 50% extra time, or commonly called time and a half. That's for SAT and ACT, the most commonly applied for and the most commonly granted accommodation. But there are a lot of other ones, like you could get large print in your test booklet. If you are visually impaired, you can get a reader to sit by you and read passages and problems. If you're hearing impaired, you can get a scribe to help you write. You can get additional breaks. You can get the use of a computer. There's all kinds of different, accommodations for the testing room. So, but most of the students we work with are the ones who get additional time and need to be strategic about how they use that time.
So from a higher level perspective, we'll just talk about all students with disabilities at once, or all students with accommodations at once. Do you find that you have to approach students with any kind of accommodation differently than you approach your other test prep students?
Absolutely. It's really important for the parents and the tutor to have an open conversation and an ongoing conversation about what the student needs. And it's important for the student to feel that the tutor is their unconditional advocate, that they're going to stand behind them and help them master a set of skills and succeed on whatever test they have in front of them, no matter what. Oftentimes, students with accommodations come to tutoring or come to the test preparation process with a lot of anxiety, and rightfully so, because they've been told for most of their lives that they can't do the things that other students are able to do. So it's important for the tutor to have, as their first sort of step into the process, a sense of, I'm here for you and I'm going to back you no matter what.
That's a really good point. I find that a lot of students come into this process feeling, that they're judged harshly because of their accommodation. And often their parents feel that way. Their parents are afraid of even applying for accommodations or admitting that they need the help, and being unconditional about saying no, that the reason you're getting the accommodation is to level the playing field for you. Is a message that is often well received.
It's probably worth mentioning too, there was a time, right, when when your score report came out, that it would indicate that you had been granted accommodations, but it's also important to know that that no longer exists. So at least as far as feeling like there's a mark on your report, students should not be worried that colleges will judge them differently for having received the accommodation, because colleges essentially don't have to know, right, that they actually received them.
Right. Yeah, that was the case before the Americans with Disabilities Act first in 1990, and then later legislation, or later jurisprudence kind of forced the College Board and the ACT to take that off of their score reports. So I think it can swing either way. I don't know if Mike and Amy, you guys have seen this too, but either parents will hide and obscure the fact that their student has a learning difference and it might need or warrant accommodations, or they'll use the learning difference to sort of shelter and protect their student from having to do things that might stretch them and might actually lead to their growth.
There's definitely a spectrum, right? We're fortunate that many of the students we find and their parents go right down the middle. They use the accommodation properly for what it's meant to. But yeah, there are some families that think that a kid will grow out of it, or can just try hard enough to not need the accommodation. And yeah, there's others that instill some kind of learned helplessness in their children.
Well, it does present an interesting, I think, dynamic sometimes for the tutor-student relationship, because it could be that the parent has always had to advocate, and the parent becomes hyper involved in the tutoring process, and sometimes in a productive way, sometimes in more of an obstructive way, maybe. But other times the parents are very supportive. But I find it interesting sometimes when parents don't want to reveal to me that their student has accommodations, where I'm like, that should be the very first thing you're presenting with, because we need to know that, because and we might as well launch into the idea of timing and how does getting extra time influence your work with students. You need to know that, and tell us how you kind of utilize that knowledge, that a student's going to either get 50% or double time or triple time, Scott.
Yeah. Well, first off, it impacts the way that they do practice tests, which we're huge advocates for. So every time a student works with us, they end up doing 1, 2, or sometimes 3 or 4 practice tests. And we need to make sure that if we're administering those or proctoring those, we get the accommodations right that they're going to experience in the real test. And then in the actual tutoring session, I think it's important for the tutor to make sure that they're modeling and implementing the same accommodation so that the student feels very comfortable and familiar with that format. So if I'm doing a timed reading passage for the ACT, I can't expect the student who gets 50% or 100% extra time to have read the passage and be ready to talk about the questions with me in the same amount of time, right? I have to make sure that I'm giving them extra time to read and process.
Well, Scott, on that note, do you try to, I don't know if North Avenue offers classes as well as tutoring, but for programs that do you find that for students with extended time, you might try to recommend tutoring because they might not be able to keep up with the pace of the class?
Yeah, that's a good point. I definitely make it clear to parents that they're going to get a more individualized approach and more attention to specific learning needs in one-on-one tutoring. I think for something like 50% extra time, a student might be able to participate well in a small group class. The tutor, however, or the instructor needs to be mindful not to put them on the spot or call on them and expect something of them that they may not be able to do.
Amy, is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I was going to say with us, it tends to be that I say, if a student is willing to speak up, I'll say to the parent, if they're going to advocate for themselves, like when something comes up in the class and they want to know how would this apply to me, will they feel comfortable, saying, hey, I get extra time. So some kids, of course, would be happy to talk about that and others would not. So sometimes my advice goes more towards, I don't know that I would want a student in a group class if the student is going to be uncomfortable kind of outing themselves. And then in those situations, I feel like I advocate more for one-on-one, because then, of course, the conversation starts immediately with how we're going to utilize these accommodations in our sessions or in the practice.
Yeah. And often a more experienced tutor is warranted too.
That's a good point. Especially parents appreciate that. Very often I hear the parents of students with accommodations asking, has this tutor worked with a student who has this accommodation before? It's relevant.
Absolutely.
I mean, everybody has to start somewhere, but it's almost, at a certain point, we really specialized. We had 1 or 2 tutors that just generally, they were the ones who would work with the learning disabled students or students with accommodations because they had the experience. And every student, they learned more about how to work in this case.
And in some cases with tutors, I mean, it's kind of a growing list of accommodations. You might have some tutors that are very comfortable with the notion of, an extra time student, right? Versus, wait a second, this student is going to need a reader. So how do I want to engage with that student? And how do I want to teach them or instruct them to best utilize a reader? That might be a good one too. How about having a reader? What kinds of things do you guys do, Scott, for students who might require a reader?
Yeah, we really encourage students to get some kind of software like text-to-speech software on their computer so that when they're doing independent work, when they're doing homework, or if the tutor's not with them or the parent's not with them, they still receive that accommodation in their practice. But then, of course, if they have a reader in the actual test, the tutor needs to be the one leading most of the verbal engagement with the test in the sessions.
We hope you enjoyed this video as much as we did. You'll find plenty more like it when you explore the Test and the Rest channel. Be sure to comment, share, and subscribe for a constant stream of insights into learning, education, testing, and admissions. For full podcasts and amazing resources, find us at testsandtherest.com.